Today we're going to be talking about those employees who wish to work from home for the foreseeable future. We've seen a number of clients who have employees of foreign nationalities who wish to relocate to their home country, mainly due to COVID-19, but also for other personal reasons and to be nearer their families. What we're going to talk about today is the issues which may arise. For you as an employer, you need to be aware of where your employees are working and living, but also the other implications relating to this. Whether the employees have a right to work in that country that they've relocated to, whether you have a payroll responsibility, the HR and employment law implications, employee benefits, your overall policy in relation to having employees working remotely, and there's some tax issues which we need to talk about in terms of tax treaty exemptions. I'm going to pass over to Tim now, who's going to take us through the basics.
Thanks, Kiki. I think just thinking about the short-term implications, there are really quite widespread things to think about. You've got the really basic HR things. Where is my employee working, living? Do I know what their address is? Do I know who their emergency contact is? Then you get to things, I think, like the whole employee well-being side of things and insurances. So most domestic UK private medical policies, for example, will not extend overseas, whereas some dental policies can do. And then I think there are those considerations that if the employee is sick, what do you do? Or sick or even worse? All of those, insurance policies that you've got for critical illness, for life cover, all of those things. What's the impact if somebody has been resident, in inverted commas, overseas? And I think in addition to those benefits-based issues, you've got, as Kiki mentioned, you've got employer tax, employee tax issues, you've got social security issues, and also you may well trigger a payroll obligation, for example. Another thing to think about, which I think is often overlooked, is the whole employer liability workers' compensation type insurances. Do you need to have one of those policies in every country that you have employees working? Even though they are employed in the UK, by virtue of them working overseas, you're creating all sorts of issues, as Kiki mentioned, right to work and possible tax issues. So just turning to the payroll obligations, you may well crystallize an obligation to register a payroll and therefore have a payroll withholding reporting obligation. You may need local bank accounts. You'll also need to look at the employee's social security position, for example, and not just whether the overseas social security is due, but how much is it? What's the cost for you as the employer? What's the cost for the employee, and what's the impact on the net pay? And I think Kiki will probably cover some of the points in terms of policy and what do you do in certain circumstances in the longer term.
Thanks, Tim. So in terms of the longer term policy, if you are going to allow your employees to work from their home country indefinitely, this will certainly trigger responsibilities for you as an employer. And you need to be aware of what they are and to ensure that you're going to be compliant. The first item would be payroll. You're going to have to pay them in potentially their local currency, and you are going to need to know what those payroll responsibilities are and engage with a third-party payroll provider to do the filings and registrations for you. Employer social security costs across the world vary differently, and you may be in a situation where your employee happens to have relocated to a country that has a much higher social security contribution than in their original employment location. So before you agree to let them stay somewhere more permanently, you need to understand the costs that are involved and where those costs are going to be higher. Are you going to be the one who takes on that cost, or are you going to have to arrange a different compensation plan for the employee to ensure that your costs are not affected? As Tim mentioned, there's mandatory employer liability insurance in most locations, which you will need to obtain, and quite often also a mandatory pension arrangement. Most of the UK benefit insurances will be invalidated, so you'll need to think about whether you want to get a local private medical insurance, dental insurance, and so on, or whether you're going to leave that for the employee to sort out for themselves, either by paying them a stipend or just having that as part of the renegotiated compensation package. From an employment law perspective, we definitely need to look at that. Whilst an employee is working in another country, over time, they will have the rights in terms of employment law for that country. So you would need to look at having a new local contract in the foreign country language, and the compensation would need to be quoted in the local currency. At that point, of course, you as an employer are taking any differences in the exchange rates. The employee may have additional rights on termination in their new country, and also different rights in terms of vacation entitlement and public holidays. All of these items need to be looked at and made aware, and will come into the mix when you negotiate with the employee what their new contract and compensation will look like. But it's not all about being an employer and the payroll. As a company, you will then have somebody operating in another country, and that can raise all sorts of issues with terms of permanent establishment, local corporate registrations, corporation tax and sales tax returns. Fitzgerald and Law are going to do a separate presentation on permanent establishment issues, so look out for that one. Tim, would you like to give us a little bit of detail about benchmarking of pay in a new location?
Sure, I think that's a really good point. If your employees are being remunerated based on working in central London, or even broader sort of UK market rate salaries, in that longer term, you're going to need to give some thought to what their overall package looks like. There'll need to be some respecting, as Kiki said, of the local laws. So in some countries, you've got 13th, 14th month pay, which can significantly increase your overall cost if you leave the annual salary as per the sort of UK reference level. And there are also different norms, costs of living, all that kind of thing in the third country, which may be completely different. So I think a lot of thought needs to be given to what happens in the future and that renegotiation. And in fact, what's possible under the local employment law in terms of negotiation. Almost certainly it will require the employee's written agreement for any changes.
So just to wrap up, we need to talk about your policy. Are you, as an employer, now going to allow any of your employees to work anywhere in the world, and that facility is available to everyone? Now, that's not always practical, but how do you decide who can and can't work in a new location because it suits them from a personal perspective? And if you need to get those people back into head office or for face-to-face meetings, who's going to pay those travel costs back to those mandatory meetings? Is that a commute? Is that voluntary? How is that going to work? It needs to come into a policy. Your policy needs to be fair, not discriminatory. And you need to work out as an organisation how the absence of that individual from your offices will impact others in terms of management, training, and so on. Is it really practical in the longer term for these people to be out of the office for significant amounts of time? All about your policy. You need to think about it in advance, because if you start with one employee and you make an exception for them, what do you do with the second one or the third or the fourth? And it will become policy by the back door. I hope this has been helpful, and we look forward to doing another video very soon.